Welcome, everybody, to another episode of the Gold Silver Bitcoin Show. We are more than honored to be sitting down today with Dr. Michael R. Edelstein. He is the author of 3-Minute Therapy. You can find his work at 3minutetherapy.com. Thank you so much, Dr. Edelstein, for joining us today.
Thanks for inviting me. I was looking forward to our interview.
Likewise. So can you speak a little bit about what it is you do and how you stumbled onto this field of study?
Oh, sure. I am a clinical psychologist, which means I help people with emotional and behavioral problems, including anxiety, depression, anger, guilt, procrastination, and all addictions. And the way I got involved with this field is when I was 18, I had all kinds of emotional problems, all of the aforementioned and more. And I came across a psychologist named Dr. Albert Ellis. I was living in New York. He had a practice in New York. And he revolutionized the path that the movement of psychotherapy was taking from the more traditional psychoanalytic model, which means you talk about your childhood to get over your problems, which really is a waste of your time and money. And he came up with a new approach, which is now called cognitive behavior therapy. He called it Rational Emotive Behavior Therapy. And that means that our emotions and our behaviors don't come from situations like our crazy parents or difficult upbringing. That doesn't cause emotional problems as adults, but rather it's our thinking about those situations or about current situations more probably that causes our emotional problems. So the basic premise here is that if you have any emotion, whether it's an emotional problem or just an emotion, it comes from your thinking, not from situations. And if you listen to people talk, psychologists, lay people, they miss that crucial point. And people say, well, I'm stressed because I'm going to be late for my deadline at work, or I'm depressed because my wife criticized me, or I feel hurt because someone called me a bad name. But that's not how we work. It's always our thinking about someone calling you a bad name, or thinking about getting fired or being unemployed that causes your emotions, not the situation itself. And that's a very powerful idea, because if it's your thinking that causes emotional problems, then you can change your thinking. You don't have to change the situation, especially if it was your upbringing that caused your problem. It's going to be very difficult to go back to your upbringing and change that. So you don't you can't offer change situation, but the question is change your thinking about it, so you don't disturb yourself about difficult events in your childhood or more likely in your current past.
Great. I'm going to just let the internet kind of catch up. It was sort of failing. So then I'll ask the next question. I can edit this part out. So great. You can hear me.
Yep.
Great. I got all of that. So that is a very powerful idea, obviously, and particularly because it now empowers the individual to do something about their feelings and thoughts, which then lead to their actions. And then, and I think that human action as libertarians might be something that we value. So can you maybe speak to how this maybe isn't as simple as thinking positive about everything, or thinking, but perhaps a little bit more nuanced than that even?
Yeah, that's a great question. So it does appear to some people as positive thinking, but to drill down a little deeper, there's a particular kind of thinking that causes emotional problems, and that's thinking in terms of demands: must, shoulds, supposed tos, have tos. And the three main ways people do that is by starting, because I prefer to do well and get your approval, Therefore, I absolutely must, I have to. And if you disapprove of me or I do poorly, that means I'm no good. I'm a loser. So if you notice the structure here, Justin, you start with a preference, a reasonable preference. I prefer to do well and get approval. And then you escalate it into a demand, a must or a should, because I prefer to do well and get approval. Therefore, I absolutely must. And that's where the emotional problems come in. Not from your preferences, they're fine, but from convincing yourself you must achieve what you would like to achieve. And then that leads to, in this case, a demand on oneself, anxiety, depression, and guilt. And so you can see how that is caused by the must, by the should, not by the preference. And when you have a must or a should, it's an absolute. So it leads to global evaluations. I'm no good if you disapprove of me or I get fired. I'm worthless. I'm a loser, which also is irrational because you can't be no good as a person. All you can be as a person is an imperfect human who acts imperfectly. Whether you're fired or employed, whether you're rich or poor, you're still only an imperfect human who acts imperfectly, and putting yourself down and calling yourself a loser doesn't make any sense and is counterproductive. Then the second area of musts and shoulds and emotional disturbance is in terms of others, not in terms of oneself. I must do well and get approval, but in terms of others, because I prefer you treat me well. Therefore, you absolutely must treat me well. You must treat me kindly, courteously, lovingly, reciprocally, understandingly. And if you don't, you're no good. So the demand points to the other person. You must treat me better. You're no good if you don't. And that leads to anger, resentment, and hostility. Then the third area of demands and emotional disturbance is the impersonal area of life or situations, not of oneself or others, but of situations. And that takes a form of, because I prefer life to be fair, easy, and hassle free, therefore it must be. And if I have hassles, if life is unfair or unjust, and if I have uncomfortable conditions in my life, it's awful. It shouldn't be that way. And that leads to addictions and procrastination. So an example of that would be, it's uncomfortable to have this urge for a drink. Therefore, I must have the drink. And then I drink and drink and drink, and I have alcohol problems. So, so the key then is to stick to your preferences. If you get what you prefer with yourself, others, or life, then you get advantages. If you don't get what you prefer, you get disadvantages, but never world-ending scenarios, never horrors, terrors, or the end of the world, or you're no good, or I'm no good, or life is no good. So that really is the approach in a nutshell. And as a therapist, what I help people do is identify their musts and shoulds, their irrational beliefs, and show them how they can question, challenge, and contradict them, uproot their demands, and just stick to their preferences. And once they do that, then they're cured, then they're sane.
So I'm sure everyone who's listening is thinking of something that they'd like to improve on, or some behavior that they would like to get control over. Like for me, for instance, it might be an anger issue that I've dealt with and been very aware of and been working on. And for me, some of the tools that I've learned to kind of cope with life, generally speaking, have been, for instance, discipline, doing my preferences, aligning my action with my values. And then another thing is not judging myself, not being caught up on failure, which happens quite a bit to individuals, and just kind of moving on, learning, moving on, not dwelling, not judging myself, recognizing I'm an imperfect human and I'm going to get another at bat here real quick. So kind of, does that bring anything to mind, or where would you start? How would you even go dig a little deeper into what we've talked about?
Well, first of all, it sounds like you've developed a very reasonable philosophy. You figured it out yourself, whereas I learned it from Albert Ellis, who was my mentor. So the only way I dig any deeper is I would say, are there any areas in your life where that you're unhappy with? And if so, is there some emotional problem that's blocking you? You could be unhappy with the state of the world, but there isn't an emotional problem that's blocking you from changing the world. So it makes sense to be unhappy about things that go against your preferences. But I would say, is there anything in your life that you're unhappy with? And then we could delve deeper and see if there are an emotional problems you have that are blocking you from succeeding. Now, you said you were dealing with an anger problem. Now, did you mean you were angry at yourself, angry at others, angry at the world, or where was the anger directed?
Stress would lead to outbursts at other people.
Anger at other people. Yeah.
Yes.
And you say you're doing better at that now. Is that correct?
Yes.
And how are you making that change? Because that's a great change that you're making on your own. So how did you do that?
Well, I think it really comes down to sticking with what I want to be doing in life, which makes me feel more fulfilled, and then also not judging myself when I fail. And then the third thing is that when I feel a certain way, I just don't say anything.
I see.
I,
So you might feel anger, but you don't externalize it.
I have gotten control of that, and the next step I would imagine is just not to even feel that
Right,
internally.
exactly.
But
Exactly.
right now, when I do that, if I need to, I'll just wander out of the room or anything. But certainly, there's been a lot of progress, and I think that is something that I learned to do. In my opinion, and obviously the way that I thought about that over the years also was the reason why I was unable to move beyond that. But I think that what really unlocked everything is just like going out, just going at life, trying to fulfill my dreams and failing over and over again. And eventually you're just like, a non-attachment principle from like the Eastern philosophy comes to mind, and you become a little bit more acquainted with kind of letting go. But like I said, I think like mapping my action to my dreams is really important. And so that comes down to like not an emotional block, but like a habitual block. So creating good habits and just being disciplined with my time also, I think, allows me to, feel a sense of control over myself, and allows me to just kind of stay in a more composed space. And I say this because I've had you've mentioned that you had a mentor, and because of the internet, there's so much information out there that I've been able to just listen and learn from others and experience on my own, I think. And the world outside is crazy, that's for sure, but that's something that we don't really have control over. And I think a lot of people really kind of get emotionally attached to that. And I think that there's a non-attached way to go about making the world better. And I think that it starts with this is a cliche, but that's because it's true, with changing ourselves.
Right, right, right. And you said a type of non-attachment, which sounds like a Buddhist idea. But so one of the questions I have about that is, it seems to me you would want to be attached to certain goals. In other words, have a vested interest in achieving them, whether it's to be successful at work or changing the world, making it a freer place for us to live in. So it seems you would want to be attached to goals. And how do you deal with that, having goals yet not being attached to them?
So, I think that for me personally, the non-attachment really comes in when if I don't reach those goals, that it's not the end of me, you know. for instance. I also have heard that family members, when a certain family member kind of starts talking about non-attachment principle, family members will get like offended and think that it means that they're like, walking away from their family and they don't love them and they don't want anything to do with them. But really, I think it just has to do more with letting them live and living and letting them live. And for me, that's the non-attachment principle in so many different ways. So like with family in that instance, it's like, no, it's just that I recognize that you're your own individual. I don't have control over you. You can do as you wish, insofar as you're not hurting yourself when I might try to help or assist at that point. And then also I have personal boundaries. So we've setting up my own personal boundaries over the years is another way in which I have been able to, I think, gain control, then set habits that align to my map to my goals and dreams. And so being like non-attachment is not certainly something that I in a Buddhist sense, am like an expert on by any means. For me, the non-attachment comes in when like I meet failure. And at that point, it's like, okay, now today's another day. The circumstances might be different. The facts might be different. So you just got to adjust quickly and not dwell on the past, learn when you can, but certainly don't dwell.
Great, great. Well, you have a great philosophy there, and it's great that you devised it yourself. It took me a few years of therapy to figure all that out with the
Well,
help
certainly
of a brilliant therapist.
I wouldn't say I figured it out on my own by any means. One gentleman comes to mind who's a really interesting perspective. He's a immigrant from the Soviet Union. His name's Gary Vaynerchuk, or Gary V. And he is essentially, from the outside looking in, like a business guru, a motivational speaker. But beneath that, once you actually like get acquainted with him, not just the caricature of him, you learn that he has a very like I guess it's I would say Randian philosophy in many ways, although he I think identifies as a liberal, as particularly a social liberal. He is a capitalist and he loves doing business and being an entrepreneur. And he imparts a lot of this wisdom to people who are very young in high school. And I would say that he has a show called Tea with Gary V. And it's amazing because high schoolers will call in and they'll share their trials and tribulations at home with their parents, telling them don't follow your dreams, like get a job and make money, or the kids bullying them at school. And he has a very sound philosophy too. And so I'm just giving him a shout out as somebody who's helped. However, starting my own business and then failing over and over again really helped me gain perspective.
Oh, yeah, that's great. Yeah, yeah. And I help my clients risk failure, because if you avoid trying things because you might fail, then you just build up the idea that if I do fail, that would be awful. I couldn't stand it. It would prove I'm a total failure. And that doesn't help. So it's good to take risks, as you did, and risk failure. How do you deal, in terms of your anger problem, how do you deal with a anger problem that many people have, that they have no control over and they couldn't predict in advance, and that is often driving in traffic and someone cuts them off and they immediately get angry? You jerk, you idiot, you practically got me killed. How do you deal with a situation like that?
I've probably been that person, but and I couldn't really describe why I deal with that. My entire view of driving has changed over the years, from the time I got my license when I was 16 till now. And I mean, I'm a pretty defensive driver, kind of taking my time in the slow lane and just paying attention to the conditions. And so I made driving an objective, rational thing and not an emotional thing somehow.
I see. Very good. Very good. Well, if you came into my office for a sanity checkup, I would discharge you with an A. So you're doing very well there.
So that's why, I think this is great, because I think this is something that a lot of people would want to listen to. And I think it was great kind of going down that path. I kind of want to talk about you a little bit more, and sort of your history and how you arrived at as a libertarian, I guess, psychotherapist.
Yeah, well, I arrived at each separately, pretty much. And the way I arrived at psychotherapy is I happened to come across Albert Ellis when I was 18 and had all kinds of emotional problems. And I heard an interview with him on the radio and then went to an interview, a talk of his in person. And he was criticizing traditional therapy, which, as I mentioned, involves going back to your childhood. The reason you have problems now is because of your childhood. So let's discuss for the next 20 years your childhood. And then I can pay off my BMW and my ranch in Texas. And so that was a traditional type of therapy. And he came up with this approach that we've been discussing, changing your thinking, not changing your past or changing situations, but changing your thinking in a way that it sounds like you've done and I've teach my clients to do. By the way, Justin, I have a book here. See behind me. It's called 3-Minute Therapy. And 3-Minute Therapy is really just what I'm calling REBT, Rational Emotive Behavior Therapy, the therapy that I use that I've been discussing. And the book has discusses how you can diagnose your own problems, what your irrational beliefs are, which cause your problems, and how you can uproot them. So a lot of people get much better just by reading the book. And I have a website called 3minutetherapy.com. 3 is spelled out, 3minutetherapy.com. And it's sort of like Economics in One Lesson by Henry Hazlitt. Do you know that book? What's that?
Yes, it's right here.
Oh, yeah, great. So then you know, and a lot of your viewers know, that in the first chapter, he discusses a basic lesson about the seen and the unseen, those kinds of things. And then the rest of the book, he applies it to different situations, wage controls and price controls and rent controls and those kinds of things, and shows how these government solutions don't work. And in my book, in the first chapter, I lay out these basic principles. Your emotions come from your thinking, from particularly must thinking, musts and shoulds. And then you change your thinking, get rid of the demands and stick to your preferences. And that's the road to a better life emotionally. And then in every chapter that follows, I apply it to a different problem. The same principle, the same structure to a different problem, such as anxiety, depression, anger, panic attacks, relationship problems, addictions, social phobia, money worries, those kinds of things. So it's laid out in a similar way. And so then I saw Albert Ellis for therapy, and he got me over a lot of the problems that I had, which a traditional therapist that I saw before him didn't really help very much, because he was more interested in my family and how I related to them and how they related to me and those kinds of things, which was a waste of time and money. And I liked this approach very much when I learned it from Albert Ellis, and I started applying it to friends and family. So if someone had a problem, I'd try to help them with the problem in this way. And I enjoyed doing that. And it involves questioning, looking for evidence, a little debating about musts and shoulds and about irrational beliefs and whether there's evidence for them, which I enjoyed very much. So I decided to become a clinical psychologist, go to graduate school. And that's how I got involved with that. Then in terms of becoming a libertarian, in the 70s, I lived in Brooklyn, New York, and a mutual friend introduced me to Walter Block, who lived in Brooklyn, New York. And it turned out that I was interested in chess and Walter was interested in chess. So we got together and played chess. And in between chess games, we debated politics. And I was a liberal Democrat then, needless to say. I was under 30 and I lived in a lefty area, so that's not surprising. We debated politics, and at that time, I won most of the chess games and he won most of the debates. So after about 2 years, I was a full-blown libertarian anarchist. as a result of Walter's tutelage. So that's how I became a libertarian. By the way, I've moved to a different approach to politics, and you could call it libertarianism plus. And it's the approach is called live and let live. I have a button, live and let live button here, and there's a website, liveandletlive.org. And so it's basically libertarianism, the non-aggression principle, but it also adds what the founder, Mark Victor, calls aspirational values, which means how to get along better with people, which will help you live better. So these wouldn't be laws. The only law that the live and let live philosophy recommends is the non-aggression principle. These wouldn't be laws, but what Mark Victor calls aspirational values. So act civilly, act tolerantly, act respectfully, have an open mind, have a questioning mind, those kinds of things. So that's called live and let live. And I like that approach very much. And it's doing quite well. Mark Victor is a quite passionate purveyor of these ideas. And there are live and let live chapters all over the world now. 10 countries in Africa have live and let live chapters. And I just started one in California. And there are chapters in Italy, Portugal, Australia, South America, and other places. So it's doing quite well. So live and let live movement, along with the libertarian movement, maybe will budge politicians to lie down and bury themselves and get out of our way.
Mark Victor was actually a guest on the show, and
Oh, he was. Oh, wonderful.
yeah, I met him at Libertopia in San Diego in like 2009 or 10 or 11 or something like that. And so he was one of the first people I reached out to have on this show.
Oh, great. So you know all about that. Yeah.
Yeah. And he spoke about the live and let live movement as well. And that's great. So I wanted to dive in a little bit into like separating thinking from emotion, because I think that is one issue that maybe some people might feel overwhelmed by. And I imagine that like, you know, there's people who are looking at, they're in debt, they don't have a good job, they're not like fulfilled in numerous different ways, and it feels so overwhelming. And all I can say is that maybe what's helped me is that I've reduced life down to that which I can control and have an effect on, and what I and those things which I can't. And pretty much every single day, the only thing I have control over is what I do with my time and how I treat people. And that's pretty much it on it, except for some, anomalous days. So can you maybe speak to thinking and like separating that from emotion?
Okay,
For
that's a good
starters.
question. By the way, I wanted to mention, Justin, you sound like you might have been influenced by Stoicism, because the Stoics say there are things you control and things you don't control. And there's no sense in upsetting yourself about things you don't control, because that's not going to do any good. So, so it's great that you understand that dichotomy, things you control and things you don't control. Now, in terms of separating thinking from emotion, actually, I'm not in favor of separating thinking from emotion, because our emotion comes from our thinking. So you can't separate them. They're inseparable. They're inextricably interrelated. So the idea is to have thinking that creates more appropriate, adaptive, helpful emotions. And that's thinking without demands, without musts and shoulds, thinking with preferences. So that's my view of thinking and emotion. They're not two different things, and we don't want to try to separate them, because if you separate them, then you'd sort of be a robot or a Dr. Spock or Mr. Spock kind of person. But you just want to align your thinking with the kind of emotions you'd like to experience in your life. Sounds like the kind of emotions you largely experience in your life. And you do that, Justin, by thinking differently, not by separating your thinking from emotion. Does that make sense?
Yes. Go on.
So that's basically the idea there in terms of separating thinking from emotion. So
Mhm.
it's our thinking or our ideology, just as in politics, it's the ideology that uh, that is more important than the weapons, because it's the ideology that leads to where the weapons are pointed. And so it's the same thing with our emotions. It's the thinking that is important, and then that's what governs our emotions.
Then can we maybe like zoom in on the thinking aspect in an emotional state? So, for instance, like people feeling the weight of the world, being overwhelmed with just say how much they have to do. How can they just reduce that to a rational equation, I suppose, if you will?
Yeah, that's a good question. And you sort of identified the thinking involved that causes people to feel overwhelmed, because you said people feel overwhelmed by all they have to do. And have to is one of those absolutistic words like must and should. So there's nothing you have to do. You don't even have to live. You could commit suicide. So there's nothing you really have to do. So when my clients think, I have to get this done, or I have to get that done, and I have to know what to start with first, and I have to do it perfectly, then they overwhelm themselves with those have tos. So one key is to show yourself there's nothing you have to do. Uh, there's only advantages and disadvantages, and you weigh advantages and disadvantages. And if you sleep all day one day and you don't do anything, all you get is disadvantages. You might get fired, but that comes down to a disadvantage. Thomas Sowell says there are no solutions, just trade-offs. And that's all we get in life, trade-offs, no final solutions.
Can you speak to the parallels between, I suppose, the economics of Henry Hazlitt or Thomas Sowell and your work in therapy?
You mean the relationship between the two?
Yeah, if there is one.
Um, well, one that comes to mind is in terms of self-esteem. And I have a chapter against the concept of self-esteem, and I did a public debate again with a Randian. And as you know, the objectivists are very big on self-esteem. Ayn Rand was very big on self-esteem, and I think self-esteem is a failed concept. And the reason is self-esteem comes from rating rating how you do, which makes sense. So if I did well, if I decide I did well in this interview, then I'll try to figure out what I did well and how to use the same approach next time in my next interview. If I decide I did poorly, then I'll try to figure out how I can improve for my next interview. So judging your acts or rating your acts makes sense. But self-esteem comes when you overgeneralize to rating your total self in terms of rating your acts. So if after this interview, if a few people see it and they say, "Great job, Michael," and then I say, "Oh, well, thanks," and I like getting their approval, so I feel good about it. But then if I overgeneralize to myself as a total person and rate myself as a good person or a superior person because I got the approval of some people, then that's where self-esteem comes in. So I'm in favor of getting rid of the concept, abolishing self-esteem. It doesn't do you any good, because if you do well, then you're likely, and you think you're a good person, then you're likely to feel anxious at the next interview. I have to maintain my high self-esteem, and if I don't, then I go down the drain. So, and then if you do poorly, then you have a self-esteem idea, then you're likely to put yourself down based on the rating of how you did at the interview or what people said about it. So if you give up self-esteem, then what's left? And that is unconditional self-acceptance. Accept yourself unconditionally, because you're always and only, whether you do well or poorly, or people like you or dislike you. You're only, always and only an imperfect human who acts imperfectly. You're never a good person or a bad person. You're just an imperfect human who acts imperfectly. And I've had a running debate with Mark Victor about this, because he says that one of the aspirational values is be a good person. And I say that's impossible. Or you can be as an imperfect human who acts imperfectly, who can do better. So focus on doing better. That gives you a direction. But being a good person is sort of amorphous. And if acting well makes you a good person, then tomorrow you could fall flat on your face and be a bad person. So that's not very useful.
Do you see a lot of people who struggle with subjective things? Like, for instance, you mentioned like the rating of the interview, which very well might just be subjective. One person might think you did great in the interview, and just so happened the person who had the final decision thought you didn't do so great, which is then something you definitely don't have control over. And it is not that you objectively did bad, it's just somebody else's opinion. Now, this translates pretty seamlessly to social media now. So you have a lot of people who are on social media a lot of the times, and now there's numbers around popularity. So you can, whereas when I was a kid, there was no number really around popularity at school. Nobody had Instagram accounts, nobody had Facebook accounts, nobody had a digital profile with 10 followers or 10,000 followers, but now you do, and at a very young age. And I think that is something that people might be struggling with who are younger. And there's a couple things there. For one, like, I mean, who cares if somebody has X amount of followers? And the second thing is that I think then, well, just simply put, makes them feel like less valuable, or they feel perceived by others as less valuable. Do you have any thoughts on any of that?
Oh, yes. In terms of social media and younger people who tend to be more hooked into it, and the numbers and the how many likes you get and how many dislikes you get, and things like that. I've read, and I haven't taken a survey myself, that there's more depression these days among younger people, and that's a big issue there. It's not a cause of it, because it's their thinking about that. That's the cause, but it's an influence. So I think social media has been an influence in more younger people getting depressed and having emotional problems, and they could use a great dose of rational emotive behavior therapy, REBT, which I teach, to help them decouple the rating of their total selves from the rating of their behaviors, or the rating they get in social media, or how the rating of how well they do. So it's two separate things. How well you do at something, or how popular you are, is one, and the other is how good you are as a person. And they're really unrelated, because no matter how many likes you get on your YouTube, you're still not a good person. You're an imperfect person who acts imperfectly. So, thinking in terms of unconditional self-acceptance. If people like me, that's great. If people don't like me, that's too bad. But it doesn't mean I'm great if people like me, or I'm bad if people don't like me. So don't rate your total self based on these other ratings, which could make more sense.
You have to
And
love
also,
failure. Go ahead.
what's that?
In a way, you have to love failure.
Well,
Oh,
yeah,
what
face
I
failure, and you can learn from failure. So that's part of loving failure. You learn from failure. Failure is your teacher. You can learn to do better. And if you didn't fail, you wouldn't do better, because you wouldn't know what direction to go in, what to improve, those kinds of things. So it's really necessary to fail in order to improve and to learn.
Did you have another comment on that before I interrupted you?
Oh, yeah, you had mentioned subjective people being subjective. Yes, I agree. We're all subjective. Nobody's objective. We all have our own filter we see the world through. And that's another problem with thinking you're a good or bad person, because it's just your opinion. There's no way to prove you're a good or bad person, or even you did well or poorly, right? Because if you have a YouTube channel, you'll get some likes and some uh, thumbs down, and so how would you add the two together and come up with some final report card for yourself? You really can't. It's false. So it's all very subjective. So it's good to realize that this is subjective. This is the way you see the world, but it's not the right way because you're subjective. And there is no right way because we're all subjective. So, so the idea, for example, of objective journalism is a fallacy, because the journalists have their own opinion and their own bias, and it's the way they see the world, and it's not going to be objective.
So, when it comes to social media, it's just ubiquitous now. I've accepted it that it's just a way of life now. And I see it as replacing the resume in some ways, that it's going to be just a social report card, if you will, in some ways. Not necessarily how many likes you have or anything like that, but who you are on social media. And so now I see people around me, they're scrolling. Most people are just scrolling on social media a lot of the times. And so while I also feel that pull, the way I've managed that is to be a producer on these mediums. So I need to post, not consume. Uh, a preliminary step to that is like really tailoring your social media feeds to be things that are aligning with your interests. For me, I have a lot of Spanish accounts I follow, or German accounts, but really I think the tool that has helped me is to be active on these mediums and to put myself out there. For me, social media is a tool to empower the individual. It can be used to empower the individual. We can be more ourselves than ever before. And from there then becomes this notion of like, well, who do I want to be on social media? Just be yourself in whatever form that may be. Oh, well, you know what? I want to talk about this topic and it doesn't really mesh with this topic. And I don't know if I should mix them, but it's like, no, that's you. Those two interests together, or 10 interests, they make you, and that's what makes you unique and therefore interesting to other people. And then the other thing is that you need to be pretty active on social media. If you're going to judge yourself, if you're going to worry about likes or comments, but you're like not posting ever, then that brings it back to like human action, I think. But like, in order for me to not get pulled into these things and just scroll, I've become an active participant in them to kind of take control of them. And part of the background of that is that, like, if I want to be relevant in certain ways, I sort of, in the ways that I want to be relevant, then I should probably participate in this
Yeah,
world.
yeah, yeah. I agree. I think that's a very good approach with social media. Just do your own thing, be yourself, as you said. That's very good. And some people will like it, some people won't like it, some people will learn from it, which is the hope with many people. And so if you just get in touch with what you believe and what makes sense to you and put it out there, there'll always be people who will learn from it and be appreciative.
What are some of the habits you've gotten into or practices that you have that have helped you kind of, you know, practice what you preach, I guess, in a way?
Yeah, yeah, that's a great question. And I teach, if you read my book, in each my book, 3 Minute Therapy, in each chapter, I have what I call a 3 minute exercise. And I do 2 3 minute exercises myself. And it's a type of self therapy exercise. And where you identify certain problems and you identify irrational beliefs that you have that are causing those problems: anxiety, depression, procrastination, addictions. And then in with pencil and paper or on a computer, you write down the irrational beliefs: I must do well, or I shouldn't be rejected, or um, I must get more likes than somebody else. And you identify those musts and shoulds and question them and challenge them and write all the reasons why the musts and shoulds are false, such as, because I prefer that I do well doesn't mean I have to do well. And there are disadvantages to doing poorly, but not the end of the world. I don't like doing poorly or being rejected, but I definitely can stand what I don't like, etc. So you think that through, write it out, and that helps you change your thinking and think in terms of preferences, not musts and shoulds. So getting back to your question, Justin, that's something I do. I write those out every day. And I think that's why I'm one of the saner people around, because I've been practicing for many years, questioning, challenging, and contradicting my musts and shoulds, and reminding myself and reinforcing the idea there are no musts, there are no shoulds, there's nothing I must do, although there are things I strongly prefer to do. And that's what motivates me, without the anxiety, without the uh, anxiety causing musts and shoulds.
Are there any sort of like adages that you come back to quite regularly, or any quotes?
Oh, yeah. So one is, for some reason, there's a tendency among people to expect others to be reasonable. So I have clients who are always surprised when someone acts unreasonably, or if you look at politics, there's so much unreasonableness among politicians and followers of politicians that some people are surprised, upset, enraged. But so one of the things I teach my clients is expect people to be irrational, and then you won't be outraged when you see tons of people irrationally following irrational politicians and things like that, and buying into all kinds of restrictive laws. So that's one thing that is useful. Expect people to be irrational. Another one is, as I've been saying, people are imperfect and you're imperfect. So don't expect yourself to do well all the time. Expect yourself to make mistakes regularly, because we all do. And then if you expect that, you're less likely to be upset, depressed, anxious about making mistakes. So that's another one. So that's one that comes to mind right now. And another one is, and I learned this one from Albert Ellis: life consists of one hassle after another, one frustration after another. It always has, and it always will, and there's no reason why it should not. Now, that might sound pretty grim, one hassle after another and one frustration after another. But in between the hassles and frustrations are pleasures and joys and achievements and accomplishments and good things also. So this is toward accepting the hassles and frustrations in life. If you expect it, then you're less likely to be disturbed. You're less likely to disturb yourself about it. Just like with your driving, Justin, you say you drive more slowly and more carefully in the slower lane. So it sounds like you might be expecting drivers out there to be reckless, so you keep out of their way. So I think that's a good adage to have. And also another one is, it's not the end of the world. No matter how poorly things go, it's not the end of the world. You'll be around another day to try to rectify it or do other things. And one of the things I do is, when I have parents with young children, I teach them to teach their children some of these slogans, like it's not the end of the world. So you spilled your milk, that's too bad. It's not the end of the world. Or you spilled your milk, well, that's a bad thing, but it doesn't make you a bad kid. So these ideas can be developed into slogans that you could remind yourself of.
Yeah, you reminded me of something. Now, when I was at my then girlfriend, now wife's house down in Tijuana, Mexico, and her mom was in the kitchen and dropped a plate, her reaction was, "Oh, one less plate to clean." And
Very good.
that was much different than how I was taught. And
Yeah.
that was an unlock for me. That was a significant moment for me to see kind of how she reacted to that. And it was a teaching moment for me. One thing that I've been experiencing more and more is the need to establish boundaries from bosses, from even family, from everyone. There's a story, it's a book, there's a book called Boundaries. It actually takes a biblical view here. However, I think the theme is very important, that of boundaries. And it starts with a woman whose day is just basically her serving other people because she says yes to everything and everyone. And so there's no time left for her, and she's overwhelmed day in, day out. And there's no time for anything, and she's behind, and it's because she doesn't set boundaries. So I've learned that to colleagues, bosses, clients, family, like everyone essentially, that like I sometimes need to make my boundaries very clear very early on, which entails being a little disagreeable. Can you speak to the importance of boundaries?
Yeah, well, I think you highlighted it's very important to have boundaries. And the way you develop boundaries is by deciding what your boundaries are. The universe isn't going to tell you what your boundaries, what the best boundaries are to have, and you decide by experience. So if you find when you're saying yes to everyone, you run out of time for yourself, then that's a red flag saying you better set some boundaries with people. Don't say yes to everyone. Maybe even have a schedule. How much time? Set aside a certain amount of time every day for other people and a certain amount of time for yourself, and even schedule your day. That's one thing I do every night. I write out a schedule for my next day, times, what I'm going to do, and things like that. And those are my boundaries. By the way, Justin, speaking of boundaries, I set aside an hour for our interview, and it's really flown by. So it's been very interesting, and I appreciate it. I just wanted to mention I have a podcast, which I do every week. It's on YouTube, and it's called 3-Minute Therapy Podcast, and it's on a podcast channel called Podbean. So each week, me and my REBT partner, Kevin Benbow, discuss a different issue and apply REBT, Rational Emotive Behavior Therapy, to that issue. The one we did yesterday was on happiness, and REBT Path to Happiness, or 3-Minute Therapy Path to Happiness. And if any of you viewers would like to be a guest on my podcast and discuss a problem, Kevin and I will cure you in 30 minutes. We give you a money-back guarantee, but at least you can watch it. The 3-Minute Therapy Podcast. 3 is spelled out, not the number, and it's the name of my book, 3-Minute Therapy. So that's basically the idea and my approach. And if you have further interest, if you have questions about applying it to yourself, feel free to email me or call me. And my email address and my phone number is on my website, 3minutetherapy.com.
And your website's 3minutetherapy.com, as you
Yeah.
mentioned, and your email is Dr. Edelstein at 3minutetherapy.com.
Yes, and 3 is spelled out.
We've had the honor and privilege of sitting down today with Dr. Michael R. Edelstein. Thank you so much, Michael, for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for a great interview. Very interesting questions, and I'm impressed with the level of rationality you've developed on your own. So that's great.
Thank you so much for joining us, and thank you so much, everyone, for listening.
Thanks, Justin.